Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're doing a rigorous, completely unflinching breakdown of one of the most intensely scrutinized and, honestly, deeply polarized figures in all of Canadian history, Louis Riel. We're going to systematically test the historical narratives, look past all the myths, and just objectively analyze the raw facts of his life and his legacy. Right off the bat, we have to confront a massive historical inconsistency. Think about this. How exactly does a man who was literally tried and executed by his own government for high treason back in 1885 become formally recognized as a heroic founding father and, as of 2024, the actual first premier of Manitoba? It's a staggering paradox. To figure this out, we need to identify the blind spots in those traditional narratives and really analyze the sequence of events that shaped his life. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Louis Riel paradox, map out the Red River Resistance, examine his exile and religious crisis, break down the Northwest Rebellion, analyze his trial and execution, and finally ask the big question, traitor or founding father? Section 1. The Louis Riel paradox. So Riel was born in 1844 in the Red River Settlement. Now, back then, this territory was administered by the Hudson's Bay Company. He was the eldest of 11 kids in a devoutly Catholic, highly respected Métis family. And he was smart. Identified early on as a brilliant kid. He was sent off to Montreal to study for the priesthood and became this fluent scholar of languages, science, and philosophy. But, and here's a key detail to keep in mind, he was also extremely hot-tempered, very intolerant of opposition. When his father died, he went through a severe emotional crisis, actually dropped out of his studies entirely, and headed back to Red River in 1868. Section 2. Red River Resistance. Okay, let's systematically look at the timeline. In 1869, the Canadian government just starts surveying the land. No consultation with the Métis. Nothing. They used this American-style grid system that completely ignored the existing Métis River lots. Talk about a massive political blind spot by Ottawa. Riel sees this, leverages his education and natural leadership, and highly organizes a disruption. By August 69, the survey begins. In November, his forces seize Fort Garry. By December, they declare a provisional government to force Ottawa to the negotiating table. But then, in March 1870, we hit a critical and fatal turning point, the execution of Thomas Scott. Before we analyze the Scott situation, we really need to understand the government Riel actually built. This wasn't some random, lawless rebellion. Not at all. Riel established a formal provisional government. Its legislative assembly was actually the very first elected government at the Red River settlement. This was a highly calculated strategic move to establish legitimate legal authority so he could negotiate directly with the Canadian government. It was a rigorous strategy. And his handling of Thomas Scott brilliantly illustrates the strategic pivot and arguably the absolute greatest miscalculation of Riel's entire career. Scott was an Anglophone Protestant who held the Métis in complete contempt. He was imprisoned, constantly fought with the guards, and was eventually sentenced to death by a Métis tribunal. Riel's justification was based on a very cold, calculated logic. He essentially believed he needed to demonstrate absolute, unshakable resolve to force Canada to take the Métis seriously. But the opportunity cost was catastrophic. By executing Scott, Riel permanently enraged Protestant Ontario. He essentially created a fractured political landscape that would hunt him for the rest of his life. Section 3. Exile and Religious Crisis. $5,000. Think about that number for a second. Back then, that was the massive bounty placed on Louis Riel's head by the Premier of Ontario. It perfectly quantifies the extreme physical and political danger he was in. Despite successfully negotiating the foundation of Manitoba, Riel was literally forced to flee to the United States just to avoid being lynched by Canadian militias. But here is where 19th century Canadian politics shows a really deep, almost bizarre contradiction. Think about the number 3. Get this. Riel was actually elected to the Canadian House of Commons 3 separate times by his loyal constituents in the riding of Provencher, all while he was a wanted man living in exile. At one point, he even sneaked into Ottawa in disguise just to sign the register book. But he was repeatedly expelled and never safely took his actual seat. So what actually happened during all those intervening years? Well, the stress took a profound toll on him. Riel suffered severe mental health struggles. He was secretly committed to asylums in Quebec under assumed names. If you analyze his writings from this period, they reveal this really deep religious crisis. He actually began viewing himself as a divinely chosen messiah, even adopting the title Louis David Riel Prophet. Eventually, though, things stabilized. He moved down to the Montana Territory, married Marguerite Monet à la façon du pays, started a family, and quietly built a totally new life. He even became a U.S. citizen in 1883. For all intents and purposes, he was completely out of the Canadian equation. Section 4. Northwest Rebellion. Fast forward to 1884. The situation up north is dire. The Métis and First Nations in Saskatchewan are literally facing starvation because the buffalo herds have collapsed. Add to that a completely unresponsive government that's just ignoring their land claims. So a delegation rides all the way down to Montana to ask Riel to come back and negotiate for them, and he agrees. But this time, his whole approach is different. He forms a new council called the Exuvadate, which means those picked from the flock. The problem? His messianic heretical pronouncements completely alienated the Catholic Church and his Anglophone allies. From a strategic standpoint, this was a massive loss. He essentially isolated his entire base down to just a faction of loyal Métis. The timeline of this 1885 rebellion was rapid, and honestly, it was devastating. What Riel entirely failed to account for, his major blind spot here was a game-changing piece of new technology, the Canadian Pacific Railway. Back in 1870, it took months for troops to reach Manitoba, but in 1885, that railway allowed the government to deploy military forces from the east in a matter of days. Despite some really brilliant early tactical successes by his military commander, Gabriel Dumont, the outcome was mathematically inevitable. Riel's forces were completely outgunned and overpowered at the Battle of Batoche, and he surrendered on May 15th. Section 5. Trial and Execution. Let's rigorously analyze the cold, hard facts of this trial. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald made a very deliberate move. He shifted the trial to Regina. What did that venue change mean? It meant Riel was tried by a jury of 6 Anglophone Protestants, a demographic that was entirely unsympathetic to his cause. Now, his lawyers frantically tried to use his past asylum commitments to mount an insanity defense, to save his life, but Riel strictly rejected this. Why? Because to plead insanity would be to invalidate the legitimate, systemic grievances of the Métis people. He made a completely rational, strategic choice to essentially sacrifice himself to validate his cause. The jury did find him guilty, but surprisingly, they actually recommended mercy. The judge, however, sentenced him to hang. So the absolutely crucial point here is how the government responded to those pleas for clemency. This quote, which is widely attributed to Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, perfectly captures the intense, raw political calculus of that exact moment. He shall hang, though every dog in Quebec bark in his favor. Macdonald was caught in a trap between an outraged Francophone Quebec demanding mercy and an Ontario demanding retribution for that execution of Thomas Scott 15 years prior. Macdonald calculated the political risks, and he chose to appease Ontario. The final result of Macdonald's calculation came on November 16, 1885. Louis Riel was executed by hanging at the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks in Regina. That singular event had a profound, lasting impact on Canada. It deeply, deeply polarized the young nation along ethno-religious and linguistic lines for well over a century. Section 6. Traitor or Founding Father? The historical lens on Louis Riel has radically shifted over time. If you analyze early Anglophone histories, they viewed him purely through the lens of empire. To them, he was an insane traitor, a dangerous fanatic, just an obstacle to the quote-unquote civilized expansion of the West. But if you look at modern and revisionist histories, they systematically examine the exact same historical facts and see something completely different. They identify the Canadian government's culpability, the bigotry, the systemic failures, and they reevaluate Riel as a heroic defender of minority rights against an oppressive government. As one Chief Justice of Canada put it, he was a rebel by the standards of his time, but a patriot when viewed through our modern lens. And honestly, the long-term legacy of Riel's life is just undeniable. Immediately following his death, the Métis were marginalized, and French language and Catholic rights in the prairies were heavily suppressed. But the political backlash in Quebec permanently altered federal politics. It actually ushered in a massive era of Liberal Party dominance. And as we look back today, the institutional recognition has completely inverted. In 1992, Parliament officially recognizes him as a founder of Manitoba. And in 2024, legislation formally recognized him as the province's very first premier. Which leaves us with this final critical question to analyze. How exactly do nations build their founding myths out of such fractured, deeply polarizing histories?
Reel's life really forces us to realize that history isn't just some static ledger of facts. It's a constant, systematic reevaluation of who we are and who we choose to elevate. When you objectively unpack the legacy of Louis Reel, you don't just learn about a 19th century Métis leader. You learn about the actual mechanics of how history itself is written. Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Keep analyzing the facts and keep questioning the narrative.